Mark Twain Selected Works. Autobiographical Dictation. Dancing on Ice Floes. February 12, 1906. Whenever my conduct was of such exaggerated impropriety that my mother's extemporary punishments were inadequate, she saved the matter up for Sunday, and made me go to church Sunday night, which was a penalty sometimes bearable perhaps, but as a rule it was not, and I avoided it for the sake of my constitution. She would never believe that I had been to church until she had applied her test. She made me tell her what the text was. That was a simple matter and caused me no trouble. I didn't have to go to church to get a text. I selected one for myself. This worked very well until one time when my text and the one furnished by a neighbor who had been to church didn't tally. After that, my mother took other methods. I don't know what they were now. In those days, men and boys wore rather long cloaks in the winter time. They were black and were lined with very bright and showy Scotch plaids. One winter's night, when I was starting to church to square a crime of some kind committed during the week, I hid my cloak near the gate and went off and played with the other boys until church was over. Then I returned home, but in the dark I put the cloak on wrong side out, entered the room, threw the cloak aside, and then stood the usual examination. I got along very well until the temperature of the church was mentioned. My mother said, "It must have been impossible to keep warm there on such a night." I didn't see the art of that remark, and was foolish enough to explain that I wore my cloak all the time that I was in the church. She asked if I kept it on from church home, too. I didn't see the bearing of that remark. I said that was what I had done. She said, "You wore it in church with that red Scotch plaid outside and glaring? Didn't that attract any attention?" Of course, to continue such a dialogue would have been tedious and unprofitable, and I let it go and took the consequences. That was about 1849. Tom Nash was a boy of my own age, the postmaster's son. The Mississippi was frozen across, and he and I went skating one night, probably without permission. I cannot say why we should go skating in the night unless without permission, for there could be no considerable amusement to be gotten out of skating at night if nobody was going to object to it. About midnight, when we were more than half a mile out toward the Illinois shore, we heard some ominous rumbling and grinding and crashing going on between us and the home side of the river, and we knew what it meant. The ice was breaking up. We started for home pretty badly scared. We flew along at full speed whenever the moonlight sifting down between the clouds enabled us to tell which was ice and which was water. In the pauses we waited, started again whenever there was a good bridge of ice, paused again when we came to naked water, and waited in distress until a floating vast cake should bridge that place. It took us an hour to make the trip, a trip which we made in a misery of apprehension all the time. But at last we arrived within a very brief distance of the shore. We waited again. There was another place that needed bridging. All about us the ice was plunging and grinding along and piling itself up in mountains on the shore, and the dangers were increasing, not diminishing. We grew very impatient to get to solid ground, so we started too early and went springing from cake to cake. Tom made a miscalculation and fell short. He got a bitter bath, but he was so close to shore that he only had to swim a stroke or two. Then his feet struck hard bottom and he crawled out. I arrived a little later, without accident. We had been in a drench in perspiration, and Tom's bath was a disaster for him. He took to his bed sick and had a procession of diseases. The closing one was scarlet fever, and he came out of it stone deaf. Within a year or two, speech departed, of course. But some years later he was taught to talk after a fashion. One couldn't always make out what it was he was trying to say. Of course he could not modulate his voice since he couldn't hear himself talk. But he supposed he was talking low and confidentially. You could hear him in Illinois. 4 years ago, 1902, I was invited by the University of Missouri to come out there and receive the honorary degree of LL.D. I took that opportunity to spend a week in Hannibal, a city now, a village in my day. It had been 53 years since Tom Dash and I had had that adventure. When I was at the railway station ready to leave Hannibal, there was a crowd of citizens there. I saw Tom Dash approaching me across a vacant space, and I walked toward him, for I recognized him at once. He was old and white-headed, but the boy of 15 was still visible in him. He came up to me, made a trumpet of his hands at my ear, nodded his head toward the citizens, and said confidentially, in a yell like a foghorn, "Same damn fools, Sam.